everybody. My name is Alix Peterson Zwane. I am the Director of Research Engagement and Strategy at the Nicholas Institute. New to the Institute, but not to Billions to Trillions, which I'm so pleased to be back here for a second year. And we have a really interesting, well, we're calling it a provocation session today. And we really do intend to provoke more dialogue, more conversation, really interesting things to talk about over lunch. I think all of us would agree that it's not provocative at all to say that a modern energy system requires digital infrastructure, if for no other reason than the ubiquity of unbundling and decentralization. The provocative thing that we're going to, potentially provocative thing we're going to talk about here on this panel today is, if you start to think about climate infrastructure and digital infrastructure as tightly coupled, what does that unlock in terms of possibilities, whether it's for firms, for markets, for policymakers, or for climate finance? And I'm thrilled to be joined by a really great group of people to help us to have this conversation. And I'll say at the outset that we really do intend it to be a conversation with all of you, so hold me accountable on that front. On our panel today, we have Anir Chowdhury, Bill Woodcock, and Scott Caruso. And I'm just going to start off by asking you each to give us a two-sentence bio that helps us all to understand why you're the right person to have this conversation with. Maybe I'll start, Scott, with you.
Hi, thanks, Alex, and thanks everyone for attending. Hopefully this is a great provocative conversation. I lead a company called GridVisibility. It's an early stage company that's digitizing the last mile of the power grid. We focus on leveraging the assets of the broadband infrastructure to accomplish this very rapidly.
We'll learn more about that in just a minute. Bill.
Hi, I'm Bill Woodcock. I'm the Secretary General of Packet Clearinghouse. We're the treaty organization that helps governments deal with communications infrastructure resilience.
Anir.
Hi, thank you, Alex, for including me in this panel. For the last 2 decades or so, I've been working in the government of Bangladesh with UNDP to advise the entire government across all ministries, agriculture, education, health, climate, to digitize all services, about 3,000 or so services that we have, and learned one thing or two about the nexus between digital and climate and how the nexus actually helps people get out of poverty.
Well, maybe you should start then first, Anir, with, when you started Bangladesh being an excellent context in which I'm sure a lot of thinking at the highest levels of government goes into climate resilience. How did your work on digital public infrastructure dovetail with climate policy and adaptation and resilience planning in Bangladesh? Are there some lessons there for us to learn?
Maybe, possibly. Maybe I'll start with my personal experience, my childhood. So when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, we didn't really have electricity across the entire country. We're talking about 20%, 25% coverage. I remember going to my mother's village home, actually, and my father's as well. No electricity. So this was childhood, no electricity, kerosene lamps, candles. Economic activity shut down pretty much when the sun goes down. So that's how we actually saw that. And I still saw this, although I didn't live there for an extended periods of time, but I would go on vacations. And I could see how when electricity started spreading throughout the villages and how economic activities got extended, people started having greater income. Kids were able to study after sundown, basically. So a lot of things started changing. I remember one particular incident. This is when I started advising the government about 20 years ago in Bangladesh. We were setting up what are called digital centers. And these are access centers where people would come, people with analog lifestyle, not having access to cell phones or internet, would come to these centers to access digital services, applying for passports, loans, birth registration, land records, so on and so forth, very vital services. And we wanted to expand that from 2 locations that we started this in 2007 to 4,500 locations, which are the rural local government institutions across the entire country. So it was a public-private partnership hosted by the local government institutions, but run by entrepreneurs who would charge a small fee to citizens who would come and access these services on top of the government services, on top of the government fees. So we realized when we were going countrywide in 2010 with the Prime Minister, and the head of UNDP was visiting Bangladesh. So we thought that we'd do an international launch of this. We realized 3 months prior to the launch date that 953 locations that we were targeting did not have electricity. So we scrambled to find money and put solar systems in those locations where we created these digital centers with 2G modems. So think about solar systems running digital infrastructure. We're not talking about high-power data centers, just small centers where 1 entrepreneur, 2 entrepreneurs would sit and basically go online to give people services by going to passport sites, land record sites. And fast forwarding to, let's say, the last few years, we saw a huge proliferation of solar home systems, about 4 to 5 million systems that were installed in the last decade and a half. About 14% of the whole population covered by this. So now in Bangladesh, we have near universal access, not reliable electricity, but near universal access, maybe 8 to 10 hours a day access. And I'd like to, Alex, talk about a juxtaposition of 3 things that I did, which might shed some light on possibilities. One is my work with Google 4 years ago, where we shared with the Google AI, the disaster management AI division, working on floods. We shared about 10 years of water data with Google, and Google was able to give us much better flood prediction down to the level of even households. I mean, we're actually nearing that. So again, the AI is learning, and based on water data, it's actually telling us much more pinpointed, with pinpointed accuracy, what households may be inundated. Second piece of work was with a New York-based charity called Give Directly. We learned from Togo, a small country in Africa, during COVID, that cell phone usage data and satellite data can be a very good proxy for people's poverty status. So essentially, we're identifying people at the poverty threshold using digital data, cell phone and satellite. So we learned from Togo, we applied it in Bangladesh, not with as good results, but still we were seeing that both inclusion error and exclusion error could be reduced with this method. So again, that's digital and focusing on poverty threshold. Now combine these two, that households that would be inundated, we know ahead of time, and we know who are the households that are below the poverty threshold at a given time, not based on census that was done 10 years ago or some kind of a survey that was done 5 years ago, but today's data, yesterday's data. The third work with Red Cross and Red Crescent that is still going on is to do anticipatory or preemptive support to these households before the floods happen, which shows that research from Oxford shows that about 30% resilience goes up if you can do anticipatory support. So combine the Google work with Give Directly's work with Red Crescent work. If you combine these two, we're still in the process of doing it. So it's still not done. So if we can combine these, then possibilities can actually emerge where we are able to support the most deserving ahead of time, thereby increasing their resilience. So I thought that I would just share that possibility as a nexus of digital, climate, disaster management, and most importantly, lifting people out of poverty at the right time, at the right place.
It's an excellent story of, I mean, it's a bit carrying on the theme that our colleague from ExxonMobil talked about, going from, you know, in his lifetime, slide rules to AI. In your lifetime, you've seen both what basic energy access can do for livelihoods and education, what public infrastructure and energy can do together to have improved the quality of services people can expect from their government, and now into this space of climate adaptation, sort of running on digital railway, if you will. Let's have another provocation that Scott tell you, sort of teased us about the work that you're doing, leveraging ubiquitous broadband services in the US. But tell us about your company and what your vision is.
Thank you, Alex. So today, our grid in the US serves roughly 400 million people. Critical infrastructure. One of the things that I've learned is that the transmission side of the grid, right, 100 kV and above, the big power lines, very well instrumented. Power flows in both directions. They use sophisticated communication systems and sensors to fundamentally ensure the reliability of the high voltage lines. The challenge we face in the US is the 6 million miles of distribution grid. That is not well instrumented. That is a 10x challenge. And it's fundamentally driven by the need for communications to support the digitization of that part of the grid. And every sensor solution today, automation equipment, requires comms. The power utilities fundamentally build their own networks to try to accomplish that. It's very expensive. The aha for me was about 7 years ago, the realization that that infrastructure already exists, and it exists 12 feet below on the poles. It's alongside the same trenches. It's on the same pads. It's the broadband industry. The broadband networks already reach roughly 90% of US households. Doesn't mean everybody subscribes, but the infrastructure is there. That infrastructure is a perfect foundation for instrumenting the last miles of the power grid. And GridVisibility, the company I'm leading, that's what we aim to do. We work with the broadband companies, and we supply the immediate, rapid, fast, high fidelity digital representation of what's going on in the power grid. And fundamentally, it affects everybody here. We provide, it enables more reliable power, more resilient, as we face the mega trends, which we all know, everybody here knows, right? We need more power. It was just discussed in the last session. We need to, we're at the same time needing more power, we're also changing the power sources, right? And it's not about clean versus fossil. I'm talking about we're moving generation from a centralized model to a distributed model. And then the third is the reality is we're facing more and more catastrophic impact on the infrastructure itself, largely driven by climate.
So this is both a mitigation and an adaptation innovation in that sense.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, part of what's fun about talking about this is it's a simple innovation. I'm not talking about creating something new. It's not rocket science. It's leveraging what's already available, right? And it's taking away the biggest constraint, which is the comms component for digitizing and automating, if you will, the distribution grid.
Another example of the digital platform or digital rails on which we can build for other strategies. Bill, let me bring you in for a third provocation. Tell us a little bit about how you and your organization are thinking about the intersection of climate and digital infrastructure.
So actually, as Anir was talking, I was just reflecting back on my visits to Dhaka 25 years ago when we were building the first internet exchanges there, and just being shocked at the impact and extensiveness of the seasonal flooding and how many people were just living with the fact that, you know, a significant portion of the year, the ground floor of their house was below water level, and, you know, they were using boats. And You know, we take for granted, I think, many of us, that undergrounding is sort of the be-all and end-all goal of last mile utility delivery, and some places that would not work. And, you know, 25 years ago, I was looking at that with very naive eyes and not realizing that, you know, climate change would continue to worsen, and much of the rest of the world is populated in coastal areas and is going to be facing a lot of the same challenges. And so the adaptations that Bangladesh has had to make are in some ways a lab for the rest of us and should be, I think, paid much closer attention to. One of the problems is that it's very easy to write off those swaths of the population and say, oh, well, they have mobile broadband, right? That's good enough. And, you know, they can charge their cell phones from solar panels, or they can charge their cell phones when we're able to get power through, and that's good enough. But that's really just exacerbating the digital divide, right? Saying some people need to resort to mobile and other people get fiber and power means some people are able to publish and participate in the internet. Other people are just consumers.
Anir, did you want to come in on this conversation?
This is very interesting what Scott and Bill put us, especially what Bill just talked about. In Bangladesh, Scott, you talked about how you use the broadband as a digital, right? In Bangladesh, we did the opposite. We realized a few years ago, about 10 years ago, that we had the Rural Electrification Board, which is REB, which actually supplies power to most of the country, the rural areas, run by about, I think, 38 or 40 cooperatives. So these are actually cooperatives in a very sort of public-private partnership model where the government generates the electricity, and these cooperatives actually transmits the electricity to the rural areas. We realized about 10 years ago that about 4,000, 5,000 kilometers of dark fiber, which is used for comms, electrical comms, are being underutilized. So we said, why not use that for broadband across the country? This is actually on poles, not underground. So I was part of the negotiation team on behalf of the government to work with private sector providers who would then provide nationwide broadband riding on the underutilized fiber that's owned by the Rural Electrification Board. And that actually allowed internet penetration. When I started my work in 2006, we had less than 1% internet penetration. Now we have about 75%. And much of that is actually riding on Rural Electrification Board's fiber that then got extended by the telcos and the local ISPs to give, we provided internet to all the schools, about 110,000 schools sitting on top of this, and they get high-speed connectivity now as opposed to mobile broadband, which is not really high speed. So the issue of becoming a provider or co-designer or producer of content and activity rather than just consumer of it gets dramatically changed when you're thinking about what is there and what can be reused for different purposes.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a great representation of using the assets of one industry to solve problems in a completely different one, right? It's like, and it seems obvious when you talk about it.
It seems obvious when you're thinking about it across the board.
Right.
But because organizations, both public and private, think in silos, right? This is my responsibility, this is my domain, this is the turf that I have to control. And when you're thinking from the perspective of citizens or from the demand side, they don't think about these silos. They're patients, they're loan takers, they're farmers. And when the government thinks about it, they think about Department of Health, Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy. But citizens have many needs, and they want a provider that can cut across all these different turfs, all these silos.
Well, let's switch gears. Building on that a little bit. What's the implications of all of this for climate finance? That's what we're here to talk about. Bill, let me bring you in on that. How do you think about what this means for catalyzing private investment? But I've also heard lots of talk about partnerships and thinking across silos. Firms also don't do necessarily a great job always of coming up with insights like you and your firm have had, Scott.
I think we have to think a lot about resilience. I think we have to think about how we provide the most service possible under changing circumstances. And, you know, we look at the distribution of power, the distribution of broadband bandwidth, and then we have, you know, central power generation facilities, which come up and down, and we've got data centers. And a lot of talk recently about the huge demand for more power and more data centers to supply AI, but one of the great things about AI is that the vast majority of that computational power and energy demand is actually flexible demand. Mm-hmm. That you know, if you're building a new model, you can build that new model during, you know, evenings only if you want to, right? You can use that power when the power is least needed elsewhere. There's a lot of this sort of, you know, resources to be found in other places. I mean, obviously, AWS, right, that many of you use, is essentially a found resource. It's the excess compute that Amazon had sitting around. So, you know, this sort of preemptible, I mean, obviously AWS is very low reliability relative to traditional computation, right? Sort of 3 nines rather than 6 nines. And that's because it's preemptible. That's because it's somebody's spare product, right? Not a primary product of its own. And that's true for, you know, most of the cloud computing industry. So I think, you know, we do need to think about these things, right? How do we use the resources that are there more effectively? How do we deal with outages and resilience in a way that don't impact end users? How do we prioritize what people really need and make sure that we're solving everyone's needs rather than just the people who are able to pay the most in a moment? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. And let me remind everyone about submitting questions here. I want to make sure that we're able to bring in other thoughts. So just reminding you all to use the QR code there. But while you guys are submitting what I hope are provocations of your own, you know, Scott, Anir, other points you want to make on this financing question?
On the financing side, it's really, I think what's interesting is it's hard to bring innovation to the infrastructure world, right? Infrastructure is big, it's scaled, it's got an enormous amount of inertia, right? You're not gonna disrupt that easily. It's really hard to do it as a startup, right? And I will tell you, when we start talking about the financing thing, one of the things that I have come to really appreciate is that in order to adopt innovation at the infrastructure scale, you've got to have something that makes incredible economic sense, right? It's got to be something that is easy to adopt, and it has to be evident, explicitly evident in value. Mm. And that's a really small set of opportunities. You're not going to find a lot to create that kind of intersection. So what I'm pleased about is we can actually address some of the big challenges facing our grid, being provoked in large part by climate and our changing needs, right? Everybody wants data centers, everybody wants AI. I'm all for it, 100%. I just want to make sure that the grid is reliable and can keep up with it. Mm-hmm. And we as citizens need a grid that we can depend on, and part of that is it needs to be instrumented. And we've just got a fast path to being able to realize that. I'll make a quick point. Our government spent $235 million in part with private industry between 2011 and 2014 to provide that kind of instrumentation that I've referred to up in the transmission lines. The deployment of what are called synchrophasers, synchronizing the phase, right? It's power flows. That's what they do. They use these devices. We can basically do that same kind of capability, actually, I would call it higher fidelity, down in the distribution grid, leveraging our platform. And that's kind of the value proposition. So now it's, how do we finance that?
Yeah.
And I don't know the exact answer, but I know that it's possible, and I know it's at a scale that's not 10x what it was for the transmission lines.
You used the term public-private partnership before, and I think the things that you were talking about in the first example that you gave were also about mixing public and private money, capacities and resources. Do we have blueprints for how to do this, or do we have to build all of these partnerships in a very bespoke way every time?
Well, since this is a provocation session, maybe I'll provoke ourselves. So maybe three things I'd like to talk about very briefly. So when we talk about investment, we think about return on investment, and typically it's again in a silo. So I'm investing in a power infrastructure, I get return on investment from that. But again, if we think of a whole of society, a whole of government approach, which is what I had the opportunity to do for about 20 years, by setting up a special program across the Prime Minister's office, the Cabinet office, which is the centralized center of the bureaucracy, and the ICT Ministry, which provides the technology. So it was actually whole of government from a political, bureaucratic, and technological perspective, and also bringing in the private sector. So three things I'd like to mention. One is utilization of underused capacity. Right, so I've given a couple of examples of that. You also talked about it. So, and then that underutilized capacity can reside in public sector, in private sector. Second is the issue of digital public infrastructure. What does that really mean? It means that a digital infrastructure that can be used for public good. It does not mean that the infrastructure sits in the public domain. It can be in the private sector, so we use private data from the telcos to target population who are under poverty line at a given time. So the data, the infrastructure, physical infrastructure may be in the private sector, but may be used for public good. So the combination of public-private infrastructure and data used for public good is what I would call digital public infrastructure. So, developing contours, partnerships, boundaries, or transcending boundaries for that. And the third is really focusing on whole economic growth. So for instance, the solar home systems in Bangladesh, the solar household systems, they created about 75,000 direct jobs for installation, maintenance, and all that. We saved about 400 million plus by not buying kerosene in the households for the kerosene lamps, and that money could be used for other things. So again, the return on investment has to be seen across economy, across the board. So if you can think from those perspectives, to answer your last question, Alex, whether there are patterns or there are templates or there are basically case studies that can lead to these templates, I think it's possible. Recently, in the last couple of months, I've been tinkering with, and I was telling Alex this, tinkering with different AI models based on the vast amount of documents that exist in terms of digital policies, energy policies. And then asking questions to ChatGPT or to Sonnet or to Perplexity or to DeepSeek or to Grok, I get very interesting results because it's actually analyzing information in a way that would take humans maybe weeks and months to do. Humans would arrive at the same results, but we can actually fast forward much of the analysis using these LLMs, very interestingly. And then I've actually asked for patterns. And again, I've found patterns. So it's very possible to create a shared intelligence between humans and AI to find these patterns and come up with templates that could apply in a particular context so that we don't do cut and paste. Because what can be learned from Bangladesh cannot be just blindly cut and pasted in South Sudan. It has to be gone through, it has to be taken through intelligent analysis and contextualization.
So I think I'm using this technology correctly, but I'm not seeing questions coming in. So I will use my opportunity as the chair here to make a little point from a policy perspective, which is, again at the level of climate finance commitments, especially in aid agencies, we are also guilty of thinking in silo. Prior to joining Duke, I was the CEO of a investment vehicle called the Global Innovation Fund, based out of London, that was intended to do early stage investing to accelerate innovation and international development. So venture style debt and equity investing in addition to grant making. And when the UK was the host of COP in Glasgow, we announced a new climate adaptation sub-fund at GIF, backed by the UK and by Sweden. We then proceeded to spend several years tying ourselves in knots about what's really the difference between funding for climate adaptation and resilience or development. I mean, the story that you have told about improved flood prediction, more timely social protection payments, more closely targeted to those in need, yeah, that's a climate story, but it's also a development and humanitarian story. And so what buckets of money are allowed to be used for that? It gets even more complexified when you think about digital public infrastructure per se as a platform. Yes, that's going to help us with climate adaptation and resilience, but it's also going to help do lots of other things as well. And so the modalities by which we, in the international stage, have our announceables about this much money for climate, this much money for adaptation, for loss and damages, that boxes us in a way that doesn't allow us to take advantage of existing platforms or underutilized capacity in a way that I think for those of us who are thinking about policy really need to take this challenge on very seriously if we are thinking about what does it mean to mobilize resources for climate when fundamentally the best strategy for climate resilience is inclusive growth and development. So I don't know how that resonates for others here, but I think we've all been talking about the challenge we face is not one in which we lower our ambitions around growth, but one in which we accommodate new ways of achieving those growth rates relative to what we've done in the past. So I will look again here, to see if colleagues have submitted any other questions here. But let me then instead say, please give us your final thoughts. But I'd actually like to frame it, going back to this as a provocation question. Give us your last provocation or your last piece of advice, especially there's so many students in this room, about what they should be thinking about, and then for the next year before we all gather again to the next Billions to Trillions meeting. Scott, I'll start with you.
So one of the topics of interest, we've already heard it multiple times today, even on this panel, is AI. And AI, we all know about it in the context of it's going to be consuming a lot of energy, for sure. We all get that, data centers, et cetera. One of the other elements of AI that we all need to remember, particularly as we start talking about applying AI in the context of grid management, grid modernization, the smart grid, is AI requires data, real data. And that's one of the elements of modernizing our grid that is often overlooked when we talk about, generically, the magic of AI solving all of our problems. What we're doing at GridVisibility, leveraging the infrastructure that already exists in the broadband world, is fundamentally accelerating the ability to get that critical data. You cannot manage it if you can't measure it. We're providing the measurements.
Thank you.
I think, the purpose of the talk here was to try and tease out how private sector investment can help address some of these issues and, make money while doing good. And I think one of the problems that the US communications sector has struggled with now for 150 years is the seesawing back and forth between, oligopoly that doesn't give us the innovation that we need and doesn't give particularly good returns on investment because it's not doing anything new that people want. And on the other hand, this sort of radically uncoordinated competition that is characterized by great innovation, but doesn't have any of the planning necessary to bring services to people, right? So, we get the collapse of 2001 where, we had great competition, but no planning, and everybody being worried about antitrust meant everybody did the same analysis and came up with the same result, which was that fiber between Los Angeles and New York was the highest return. Everybody built fiber New York to Los Angeles, and all the bankers went away really unhappy because the entire market upon which those loans had been predicated collapsed. And at the same time, every other market in the US was unserved, right? So, where I see things working a lot better is where you have smart people going into government as well as the private sector, and smart people in government able to, bridge that gap of antitrust and say, look, you guys are all competing here, but what we need you to do is each serve some specific need, not all pile onto the same one because you're afraid of coordinating. So I think, having smart people in regulators, in government, who are able to take the bigger picture view, able to see the public benefit, and able to help industry coordinate so that each investment is going to get a return on, serving some specific need, and they're not all inadvertently going to pile on top of each other and destroy the market. That would be really helpful, I think.
That's a great provocation. Anir.
I was talking to some students yesterday after the session, and I was asked because I worked with UNDP, USAID, Gates Foundation over the last 20 years, and many others. So what was the most difficult thing to do? Mm-hmm. That was the question. And I had to think, and my reply was that redesigning a program was the most difficult thing to do. And in today's context, the reality shifts continuously. Even without the chainsaw Doge effect, reality changes continuously because of many different pressures, the poly crisis, as we call it, right? Environmental, human-created crisis. And when we design a program, and Alex, to your point, let's say World Bank or UNDP or USA designs a program, it's with the reality of yesterday. Program is designed today, and we deploy it, and then a year later, reality changes. But we are still using the reality of yesterday to run a program tomorrow. So we need to continuously redesign this. And I'm just sort of appealing to the schools of public policies and to the development agencies that whether we can actually teach our students, whether they're executive students or they're sort of students that are just going into their careers, how to reprogram things and not get stuck with log frames that we conveniently still follow. And how to program across disciplines, how to do interdisciplinary programs across health and education and climate change and job growth and economic inclusion. So designing for cross-sectoral disciplines and designing for redesign, essentially. And the last thing, I've been told that I have 1 minute, I'll take less than that. Last thing also, based on the provocation that I received yesterday in the first panel of how to rethink, reimagine foreign assistance. So US calls it, or the developed countries call it foreign assistance. The countries who receive the assistance call it development assistance. No matter how you look at it, we have to reimagine this. We have to rethink this. Because we've been pushed it off the precipice. We could have had 2 years to rethink it, potentially, but maybe we would not, because our backs would not have been against the wall. Now it is. So whether that kind of rethinking, reimagination could be convened by academic institutions, because they seem to be more neutral. If a development bank does it, it won't be seen as neutral. UN agencies may not have enough teeth to actually push things through. Academic institutions potentially. So there's something I started a discussion yesterday, and whether it's possible to do that, whether Duke would play a role in that kind of a convening to start that conversation of how to reimagine foreign/development assistance and create something new.
And
that's an
development
appeal.
more generally. Well, with my Nicholas Institute hat on, which is an epicenter of interdisciplinary work at Duke, and as is the Duke Climate Commitment, I think that's a wonderful note on which to end. Thank you all.